What's going on, guys? I'm Chris and this is Regular Guy Training. Today we're going to talk about the Lancer L5 Advanced Warfighter magazine, and we're going to compare it a little bit to its major competitors, and that would be the OK Industries GI magazines and Magpul PMags as well. Now, before we get into the review proper, I'm going to mention a couple of things. I have been sitting on 15 of these for about 6 years now. I actually originally purchased 20 of them, but just over time you end up losing one here and there, mostly because if I'm teaching a class set and I've spent 12 or more hours for the last 3 or 4 days, sometimes more than that, teaching, and even if I realize I'm missing one of those magazines that's just in a field someplace, I'm probably not going to go look for it in the dark. I just accept the loss. That said, I've been on the last 15 for quite some time now, and again, I originally bought these about 6 years ago. So I figure that between that and the average of 400 to 500 students that I get a year, that averages 2,000 rounds each, and then you might want to divide that by 2 because I teach round about as much pistol as I do rifle, and the numbers sort of make themselves clear. Between my own personal use and the substantial number of rounds that I observe fired by the student base, I think I have enough end user and observational data to more or less come through with a pretty solid opinion here. That said, I hear a lot of things on the internet, and a lot of them are very specifically targeted towards the Lancer magazine in kind of a venomous way for no reason at all. So before we get into a review proper, I'm going to address a couple of things right after a little bit of ad time. Today's video is sponsored by the Sonoran Desert Institute. Have you ever thought about making a living in the firearms industry? If you enjoy gun repair, ballistics, learning about firearms, the Sonoran Desert Institute might just be a good fit for you. To find out more about SDI, visit sdi.edu. Use the link in the description down below or call 480-999-4767 today. And now back to the video. So the following things that I hear about Lancer magazines on a regular basis is A, they're really hard to seat into a magazine well and get locked up on a closed bolt. The other one is that when you drop them, they just spontaneously explode all of their ammunition all over the place. And I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Both of these claims, regardless to where they're coming from, are both fictional and demonstrably fictional. So as I sit here and talk, you're going to notice 15 magazines that are loaded to standard capacity that are being very easily inserted into the lower receiver of my BRN4. Yes, the lower receiver is absolutely in spec. I've already done a bunch of work with this setup, and if there was an issue with the lower receiver, we would have absolutely seen it by now. That said, not only is it really easy to do the insert on a properly loaded magazine, but it's also quite easy to get it seated with a simple tab if it is improperly loaded as well. Now, what do I mean by proper and improperly loading? And I understand this. Some people don't quite understand that sometimes, especially with a lot of use, rifle magazines can be overloaded by one round. So the easiest way to get around this without having to count all the time is to simply look at your follower. The raised portion of your follower is more or less your even number indicator on the magazine. So if you load the magazine until it stopped and you notice that your 30th round should be on the right, but the magazine stopped loading with a round on the left, the easiest way to figure out whether or not this rifle magazine is overloaded is to put your thumb on that top round and push down. If it doesn't move at all, you've overloaded the magazine, and you should strip out that top round to make sure that your count is actually at 30. And the reason for this is simply A, there should be a little bit of movement so that it is easy to seat a magazine on a closed bolt, and if you overload your magazines for long periods of time, it doesn't matter what manufacturer they are, you will over time damage those magazines because there's too much tension on the feed lips. And while the damage that you're doing to this magazine might not be instantly apparent, it will be readily apparent over time. That said, if you have something like a GI magazine or a PMag, for instance, you're in the moment, you can't undo it, and you need this magazine seated right now, a lot of times a good stern tap of the magazine into that magazine well will seat it anyway, but you will have to do a little bit of extra work to get that first round stripped off, particularly on GI magazines, and most of the time that requires you to run your charging in. What's interesting about the Lancer magazine is that not only is it easier to see on a closed bolt properly and improperly loaded, it's also easier to get that first round stripped off as well. So this claim is straight up fiction, which is hilarious because if you start looking around the internet, there is at least one short of a guy doing a lot of play acting on him trying to claim that Lancer magazines are trash, but you'll also notice that he's pulling out a lot of theatrics without putting any real pressure on his magazine into the magazine well as start, and you'll also notice that the comments are turned off, which is rather convenient. So full stop. stop. Doesn't matter if it's in a comment section or in a Reddit thread, this is straight up fiction, and it always will be fiction, and it becomes even more fiction if you use your magazines and equipment regularly. Now let's go on to the spontaneous explosions of ammo. There's a lot of people that I have seen actually try to claim that if you drop a loaded Lancer on the ground and it lands anywhere, you could instantly lose half of the contents of that magazine. The other nonsense claim that I have seen on more than one occasion, more than quite a few occasions actually, is industrial air quotes witnesses that see a Lancer magazine dropped on the ground that was brand new and it came apart like it was the Challenger or something. Look, as you're probably able to put together because you have an IQ greater than that of a goldfish if you're watching this, that doesn't happen. It straight up does not happen. The only time that you ever see magazines disassemble themselves is if they are extremely worn and the floor plate's ready to give up. I've seen that specific example on GI magazines, P-mags in extreme cold, and these were old magazines also. And I have in fact seen this with a very, very old Lancer magazine as well, under basically similar circumstances, which makes sense. Polymer does suffer a little bit in extreme cold weather, and we're talking about negative 20-ish degrees. So while I have seen that before, these are also extreme circumstances that these individuals likely never saw in the first place and just want to say things for attention. Now, the next thing that I'm going to talk about here before I get into feature set, pros and cons and all that jazz is I'm going to head off a bunch of questions in the comments section because I'm likely to be asked, what do you think about X and Y and Z and that sort of thing. As far as reliable magazines that are consistently reliable, that are easily available, that you can just look up and go spend a bunch of money on and be good to go, and you're not really going wrong with any of these, is of the following, right? You have OK Industries with their SureFeed stuff, whether it's the GI magazines that have the grip texture on them and the blue followers, or the military clone magazines that have the gray followers in them. I have seen them work a million times. I own a bunch. They do great. Magpul P-mags work great too, the Gens 2 and 3. I personally prefer the Gen 2 because once the Gen 3s came about, they redid their formula a little bit to make the polymer a bit stronger. Now, the reason why I prefer the Gen 2s is because there isn't an over-insert tab on those Gen 2s. I have seen people over-insert their magazines anyway, and when it's a Gen 3, that over-insert stop breaks and basically welds the magazine into the gun in a position where you couldn't feed ammunition anyway. So I'd rather have a magazine that I know is reliable because it just is, understanding that the possibility of an over-insert on a lower that's in spec is already rare, but then if something wild does happen, I don't want the what if present on whether or not this over insert is going to cost me huge as far as time and the ability to get the friggin' magazine out of the gun. And while we're at it, I'm also going to answer this next set of questions with magazines that I would never recommend to anybody because I have watched them all fail over and over and over again, and enough people also have to the point where A, they're not used anywhere anymore because they're not produced, or B, people just are not as aware of the fact that they suck. Let's talk about the all-star house of awful. MFT is bad. Daniel Defense never worked well. The Surefire Quad Stack magazines, the 60 rounders, that is the cheapest $100 magazine you're ever gonna buy. Pro Mag super sucks. Tapco super sucks extra because they're not even made anymore. Men 2 and ETS super suck. They start and end bad all the way around. Every drum ever is not gonna hang, and every other Quad Stack magazine on earth is not gonna hang either. But now let's go ahead and move on, talk about the feature set and pros of this particular magazine, and then we'll talk about the cons, because there are some material cons to this as well, things that you do actually need to consider if you're actually looking for the nuance in this. I will say that if you're not looking for the nuance, and if you're just looking for reliable boxes with springs and followers that feed guns, a lot of this is going to go right over your head. But for those of you that like to monitor logistics, especially because only amateurs ever think about just the tactical stuff, professionals are looking at the logistics side of the house as well. This stuff at this point is going to matter to you. As far as the feature set goes, as standard, it comes with a robust anti-tilt follower. That should be something that just is standard. Non-anti-tilt followers should be becoming rather rare at this point in time, but it's there. Lancer's claim to fame, more or less, is that they have a hardened steel skirt, which is also properly coated. So even if you have finish stripped off of it, it's still going to have that finish embedded in the steel skirt itself. This does actually a bunch of things that people don't realize. Not only is it real impact resistant, and there's more than a few guys on YouTube that have done basically horrendous testing on them to see if whether or not they work, and they really do. The other part of this is that it allows you to have a translucent magazine that doesn't come apart like the Challenger if you put it under any real stress. Because as previously stated in a video I did last week on the T-Mags, unless you are trying to make prohibitively expensive polymer magazines, there isn't really a way to make a translucent magazine that isn't either A, huge, or 2, made out of materials that would make each magazine about $100, like actually strong, unless you plan on doing something like so. And these guys figured this out a long time ago. So it allows them to keep their costs down, give them the ability to produce a reliable magazine. It's a pretty solid trade-off. Another teeny tiny thing is that the top edge of these skirts is actually what interacts with your magazine release, like the little bar that's in there. And this is extremely small as far as a difference is concerned. Don't take this as a big difference. But a metal component on a polymer magazine is going to shave that polymer magazine a little bit more than it would on a metal component like this skirt, which actually, as far as Rockwell hardness is concerned, is likely harder than the magazine catch itself, because a lot of mill standard parts, at least for this particular part, are not made of extremely robust stuff because it doesn't need to be. It's not a high stress part. The difference here again is extremely small, but it's a nice touch. Obviously the polymer is nice and shock absorbent. We've all figured this one out a long time ago, and it isn't more or less shock absorbent than its competitors as far as the polymer space is concerned, at least the reliable polymer space is concerned. Again, much like its competitor, the P-Mag, easy to disassemble floor plate, and while the set of circumstances that you will need to take apart a magazine in order for it to function again, because you have to clean it out, is extremely rare, it's just nice to have. Something that I'm liking actually a little bit more over time, honestly, is the grip texture on the magazine itself. I have taught and I have trained in plenty of really crappy environments, and when it is actually cold and wet enough for the things that aren't sharp to be super slick, it's kind of nice, especially when my hands don't want to work as good, to be able to go into the pouch on my chest and just grab this guy and feel it grab me a little bit. And while this isn't a huge issue, I've done this sort of stuff with GI magazines without any real problems at all. It is, again, a nice touch. You'll notice a theme here, that it's just another little bit of a nice touch overall. As we all know at this point, they're available in a lot of different colors, not just smoke or Skittles. You also have pretty good magazines to help you actually camouflage into different environments depending on what they are, like FDE or a foliage green. And just enough to cover up the brass that's in the magazine, it is indeed a little bit harder to see. Now this is only making real sense and is only going to get a north and south from people that are in a specific billet to where that matters. That said, it is something that is kind of nice to have, because anything that makes you harder to see should be a thumbs up. In addition to this, from the very first magazine that they released up to now, and now includes the Gen 2 version of this magazine, which I actually don't have, I'm waiting on 2 to arrive, the dimensions are the same as a GI magazine and will fit in any rifle that takes a GI magazine except for an F2000, which no one even remembers what that is anymore, and even if you do, you shouldn't, because it's a terrible rifle to start. And lastly, and this is sort of a big deal to me, and a lot of guys will kind of giggle at this because you've seen me do enough videos on like the BRN4 and talking about having a ready mag on the gun and not worrying about what's on the gun as far as weight all that much and that sort of thing. But think about it this way, because I am going to talk about weight of the magazine itself. A lot of times, especially if you have specific mission profiling, and that doesn't even really matter. A lot of times if you start talking about different mission profiles and that sort of thing, and that could mean a great many things to a lot of different people, not just suited and booted types. But when you start talking about mission profile and that sort of stuff, a lot of times you kind of can't help what goes on the gun unless you are deliberately trying to make things as skinny and light as possible. A lot of times you have to give up weight for capability to simply be able to do the job that you're trying to do. That said, if you're carrying a lot of weight on your body, a lot of times if you're trying to shave as much weight as you can for capability, which, yeah, it can affect the rifle too, because if you got something that does the same job but is lighter, yeah, why not? Take it. But this is far more important, generally speaking, for stuff that goes on your body, gear that goes in a bag or on your chest or in your leg pockets or whatever. And a lot of times if you can save a bunch of ounces here and there, that translates into tens of pounds later, depending on what it is that you're trying to save weight on. This guy coming in at the weight that it does makes it impressive all by itself. You see this thing plopped on a scale at 3.88 ounces, and then when you start weighing other magazines, it starts to get quite impressive, because when you measure it up to its competition, you see the Gen 3 PMag coming in at 5.1 ounces. The Gen 2 PMag comes in just a touch under 5 ounces at 4.9. And a GI magazine, which a lot of people wouldn't think is heavier than a Lancer magazine, comes in at 4.1. And interestingly enough, enough, the Magpul T-Mag comes in at 4.3. So not only did they make a worse magazine than Lancer, they made a worse magazine by every conceivable metric, which is hilarious. Why am I making such a fuss over essentially an ounce or a little over an ounce? That's not that big of a deal if you only got 5, 6, or 7 magazines on your body, but if you got someplace to go and you're going to be out a while and you actually have 10, 15, 20 magazines between what's on your chest and in bags, we're now talking about getting pretty close to 1.5 pounds that you just never had to carry, which is, at least to me anyhow, kind of a big deal if I got a long way to go, and especially if I'm trying to do everything I can to conserve a little bit of weight on the stuff that's weighing on my spine. So if it's a super reliable magazine, and if it works well, and it's also considerably lighter as far as proportions go, those are big ups in its favor. The thing about this though is that this nuance actually continues a little bit. As I sat here and explained this, you'll notice that each one of these little things is basically nothing on its own, but over time it actually starts to stack up considerably. When you look at the sum of its total parts, we actually have considerable advantages now. For instance, the translucent nature of this magazine actually makes it really, really easy to monitor your logistics. Look, the amateur only looks at the tactical crap, but the professional looks at the logistics and infrastructure of things as well, because that's how you ensure continuity of things versus coming to a screeching halt for no reason. And yes, I hear you say, windowed PMags absolutely exist, and those are solid magazines, and during the day, they eliminate the advantage that this thing has damn near completely. But I will say that during the day, and if I'm moving fast and I'm just trying to take quick stock of what's on my body between what's on my chest and in the bags and all that stuff, I can quickly purse through this and just sort of see exactly where, okay, 20 is here, about halfway up the magazine's 15, okay, no problem. 20 is here, just past a little bit of reinforcement where it gets nice and smooth, is about 15, and you more or less know where you're at from there. But it's not that big of an advantage during the day. What I will say is when I'm trying to do this exact same thing at night, the windowed PMag becomes almost useless because it is significantly more difficult to check that in the dark. Now, with a little tiny red mouse light, that's not that big of a deal, but when I'm in an environment that doesn't allow me to use light at all, where I'm trying to stare up toward the sky to get a little bit of contrast because the light that's captured in from this overcast sky gives me a little bit of background, I can actually see through the magazine body round about how much ammunition I have left through mostly shadow, and obviously you got to focus in on the object you're looking at and things like that. Just a thing that I noticed that a lot of people don't really talk about, and it makes sense that they don't, but these are just things that I've noticed over time. This allows me to monitor my logistics before, during, and after a fight. That leads right back to before again. That really does help me out because it allows me to understand what I am going into significantly easier. Granted, at night in the middle of a fight, I'm obviously not going to be sitting here staring at the sky and trying to figure that sort of stuff out, but you can more or less understand what I'm getting at, is that if I have the ability to look at this pretty easily and figure out where I'm at, it does offer itself its own list of advantages. Something else that I noticed, and this only matters again to people that are looking at the nuance, when these magazines are empty and they start clacking together, especially once you've had to bag a bunch of empties because you're trying to sanitize an area or whatever, when they start clacking together, they make a considerable amount of noise. GI magazines being clearly the worst because it's just an empty hull of an aluminum or steel magazine that makes a lot of noise. But what I've also noticed, as good as the Gen 2 and 3 PMag are, they do make a lot of noise as well, even if it's just a little bit less than a GI magazine. What I have noticed is that while this makes noise too, it makes considerably less noise than those magazines. And while, yes, you can put these in a bag in a slightly orderly fashion so that you're not clacking all over the place, if you don't have the ability to do that and you're just trying to sanitize an area and you got this stuff flopping around in dump pouches, less noise is less noise. And lastly, the same reason why I like the Gen 2 over the Gen 3 PMag is that there isn't an over-insertion stop on these magazines. I just prefer that simply because I don't like to introduce what-ifs that can hurt me. Because under the rare set of circumstances that I do get a magazine over insert, I can just pull the thing out and then treat the lower gingerly until I'm at a place in time where I can figure out why that happened in the first place. So as you can probably tell, the advantages that stack up on this thing, these advantages do not stack up enough to actually mean something. The best way I can put it is like this. A lot of people don't like the EOTech because they figure it to be real busy and it doesn't give them a ton of information until they know how to use every single thing in that reticle, and now suddenly it's tons of information because you understand the nuance of the entire optic, not just the dot and the ring in front of your face. And how I look at these magazines is fairly similar. For lots of people, the advantages that I'm talking about right now means nothing. But for some, especially for those that are discovering these little nuances for the first time, that might actually help you out in your decision-making process, so that's more or less why I'm making this video. Now, with all the advantages that I've talked about here, there are some considerable disadvantages to this particular magazine, and a lot of it is on the logistics side of the house. Now, the first and foremost that I'm going to bring up is cost. When you compare Lancer magazines to Sure Feed Anything and Gen 2 or Gen 3 PMags, there's a significant difference in cost because the Sure Feed, the Gen 2, and the Gen 3 PMags all roughly hang around the same price range between $10 and $14, and sometimes significantly less, hovering around $8 or so per unit. If you find them on sale someplace, and usually it comes in like a 10-pack. The Lancer, on the other hand, depending on who you are, this hurts. It's usually around $20 a unit. Now, that all by itself makes perfect sense as to why a lot of people would just look at the price tag and be like, that's not gonna work for me, because it just makes sense. $10, $20, or $25 magazines, depending on where you get them, and this is ship cost, at least right now, is considerably different price-wise to any of the magazines I just mentioned at 10 units. So if you're trying to pick up 10, 20, 30 magazines, that is a significant difference, because what you're looking at is either at or just under double the cost per unit of these other magazines. The other significant downside to this is that all the little things that I said that are nice touches and that kind of stuff, as I previously stated, this means nothing to anyone that is just looking for a whole bunch of boxes with springs and followers in them that they would like so that they can feed their guns with. If that is the primary thing that you're looking for, is just to have a lot of magazines that are reliable and cost effective, Lancer is honestly just not for you. There are advantages to having the magazine, yes, but there are not enough of them to really justify it if all you need is 100 magazines at the most effective cost to you possible. Stacking on top of this, if we talk about all three of these, Sure Feed, Magpul, PMags, not the T-Mag, the T-Mag sucks, and then Lancer. If we compare all three of these to each other and really rate them on their merit of reliability of just feeding the rifle, and this is under normal use where you're actively trying to protect your magazines, you're trying to take care of your gear, you're trying to do the best that you can not to get them run over by trucks, all of that stuff. From what I have personally observed, there is no material difference reliability-wise between the three. And there's a lot of people that are going to come up with their own anecdotal stories about how in their military unit they had a bunch of recycled range trash GI magazines, which that's not taken care of at all, no wonder it's unreliable. Or they're going to talk about any other thing that happened with any other individual magazine, and this is why they hate it. I'm going to tell you straight up hard facts based off of large numbers of people that buy their own equipment, take care of their own equipment, and are interested in doing well with that equipment. There is no reliability difference between the three. If you are not stupid with your gear, they all function equally well and they will all feed the rifle reliably. So with the pros and cons in place, all this really turns into is a decision-making process. Everything that I just covered, all that's really to be considered from there is, would you benefit from having a bunch of these? If listening to all of that, your little internal voice said to you, no, I'm good, I'll just stick with my Gen 2 or Gen 3 PMags, or no, I'll stick with my Sure Feed mags, or whatever. That is totally understandable. But at the very least, there's now a source that can simply and directly say, if you haven't considered this as a real and true contender in this space because of what some guy said about a simple drop test that he never actually saw, didn't perform, and isn't telling the truth in the first place, I would highly encourage you to reconsider, because over the last 6 years, I am using apparently now the worst version of the Lancer magazines, and regardless of that fact, I have never felt undergunned, I have never felt like I've had unreliable equipment, and under a very large list of sets of circumstances, environments, and use cases, I have never once thought about whether or not my magazines were going to feed my rifle. But hey, now you have the information, and now you can make a decision all on your own. Wrapping this all up here, if you'd like to come out and train with us, you absolutely can. We have a lot of classes that are scheduled out through through December right now, and I cannot wait to do the cold weather class in December in Ohio. Mostly because it's going to be really difficult on equipment and people. But there's a lot of other stuff that is available, including a night vision class and several other things this year. Also, a vehicle class is available too. Speaking of this, if you would like to support us through Patreon, you absolutely can do that too. And if you want to get something out of it, $41 a month gets you as much training as you would like with us, unless you would like to schedule a private class or would like to attend the vehicle class. And the only reason why we don't include that is for simple logistics reasons. It's sort of a pain in the butt. That said, if you want to support us through all of our little social media outlets, links for all of that, including all of the class stuff and the website, are linked in the description below. And also, if and only if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, go ahead and give us a like, a subscribe, hit the little notification bell, because that's the real subscribe button anyway. And remember guys, a regular guy's firearm is the last defense against tyranny. Peace.